On Christmas Eve, my daughter looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't make this awkward. You're just a guest here." The words struck harder than any storm I had ever weathered. I had built that very house with my hands, laid the beams, painted the walls, and carried them both, her and her brother, on my shoulders through winters that nearly broke me. And yet, in one sentence, everything I had poured into them was wiped away. I was no longer father, no longer family. I was a visitor in the home that carried my name. The room was filled with light, laughter, and the warm smell of cinnamon and roasted meat, but none of it touched me. They smiled at each other, exchanged knowing glances, passed plates as if I weren't there. When my hand reached for the bread, no one noticed. When I cleared my throat to speak, their laughter rolled right over me, drowning my voice like it was nothing more than background noise. I wasn't forgotten. I was deliberately unseen. Every detail cut deeper. The chair they gave me was pushed against the wall, a seat for someone they hadn't really expected. My stories, once the threads that tied our evenings together, no longer mattered. I tried to recall a memory of when she was small, afraid of the dark, and I stayed by her bed humming until she fell asleep. But when I opened my mouth, her eyes darted to her phone. My son nodded politely, then turned away to speak of business with someone else. I was reduced to a shadow, tolerated, but unwelcomed. And yet I could not stop seeing the years in every corner of that room. The tree sparkled with ornaments I had bought one by one during leaner times, when even bread felt like a luxury. The wooden table bore the same scratches from the night my son spilled his milk and cried while I promised him it was nothing. Even the window panes carried the memory of my hands fixing them in the cold with nails and glue so their breath wouldn't freeze inside. Every inch of that place bore my sacrifices, but they looked at me like I had wandered in from the street, like a stranger who had stumbled upon their gathering. The betrayal was not loud. No one raised their voice, no one cursed me. It was quieter than that, and worse. They had erased me, not with anger, but with silence. And in that silence, I felt smaller than I ever had in all my years of working, fighting, and loving. That night, as I sat in my corner chair, watching them laugh around me, something inside me shifted. I realized that the greatest cruelty is not hatred, but dismissal. Hatred still admits you exist, but dismissal buries you alive. And so, as the laughter carried on and the food passed hands that no longer reached for mine, I sat still, invisible at my own table, and felt the first stirrings of a decision that would change everything. If they had made me a stranger, then I would leave them with the only thing they could not silence, my final words. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow and keep bringing you more stories every single day. And now, let's continue. The laughter circled the room in waves, bursting out in little clusters that rose and fell like a fire I was no longer invited to warm myself by. I sat still, listening, and though my name did appear in their mouths, it was never whole. It came in fragments, cut short, half-spoken, tangled in whispers not meant for me. I wasn't invisible. No, that would have been easier. I was remembered just enough to be dismissed, like a burden they couldn't quite shake but wished would fade away. Every word carried weight, not in what was said, but in what was carefully unsaid. When they spoke about the past, my place in it was erased. They told stories of triumphs I had carried them through, but the details that had once been my sacrifices were brushed aside as if they had come from nowhere. I was not absent, I was unwanted presence, tolerated like an old photograph that no one dares to throw away but no one wants to frame. My son leaned toward his cousin, their shoulders almost touching, laughter spilling between them like a private language. My daughter's eyes darted around the room, landing anywhere but on me. They shared glances that stitched a web around the table, and I was left outside of it, watching them weave themselves closer while pushing me further away. It was not cruelty in the way most imagine it. It was not loud, not cutting. It was worse. It was the steady act of peeling me away from their story, layer by layer, until my presence became a shadow stretched thin across the wall. My name was not cursed. It was softened, shortened, swallowed, as though speaking it fully would make me too real, too undeniable. The shame I felt did not come from what I had done, but from the way they decided to see me, as though my years of sacrifice had been reduced to nothing more than a note in the margin of their lives. And that note, they now agreed, was too inconvenient to read. I sat there hearing them laugh, watching them lean closer together, and it struck me with a force I could not deny. Belonging is not about being in the room. It is about being wanted in the room. And in that moment I understood I was no longer wanted. I was no longer family. I was the obligation seated at the edge of the celebration, a reminder they wished they could forget. And as the fire of their laughter burned without me, I felt the cold settle deeper in my chest. It was not the kind of cold you wrap yourself against. It was the kind that tells you something has ended long before the words are spoken. The sharpest wound is never carved by enemies. It is carved by the very hands you once held steady, the very voices you once taught to speak. That night the knife came quietly, hidden in the smallest gestures. My son turned toward me with a smile so thin, so measured, it carried no warmth at all. It was the kind of smile you give a polite stranger passing you on the street, someone you'll never think of again. To receive it from him, the boy whose scraped knees I had carried home, whose homework I stayed awake to help finish under dim light, was to feel my fatherhood collapse in silence. My daughter's voice, once filled with trust, now felt rehearsed. She asked me questions about the weather, about things she already knew the answers to, as though she had forgotten that I had once known every secret of her heart. She kept her tone light, her eyes distant, and her words shallow, like someone performing civility to keep from admitting how far the distance had grown. She was not cruel, not sharp, not even dismissive in words. No, she was worse. She was indifferent. Indifference is colder than rejection. Rejection still holds recognition. It tells you that you mattered enough to provoke emotion. But indifference is a void. It is the erasure of history, the quiet declaration that the years you gave are nothing more than dust on their shoes. And in that room, in those smiles and shallow questions, I saw my life reduced to dust. The cruelest thing was the familiarity of their faces. My son's jaw carried the same stubborn line I had once seen in the mirror, the same fire I thought would build him into a man who remembered where he came from. My daughter's eyes still held the light of the child who once ran to me when storms shook the windows. And yet those features, so familiar, so mine, looked at me as though I were no one. That is the knife of familiarity, to see yourself reflected in faces that no longer claim you. Around me the room hummed with cheer, forks clinked, glasses rose, stories flew across the table, but I sat in the center of a silence only I could feel, cut open by the people who owed their very existence to my sacrifices. They had not shouted me down, had not thrown me out, had not raised a hand. They had done worse. They had buried me alive in politeness, in hollow smiles, in questions that proved they no longer cared to know me. That was the moment I understood the full weight of betrayal. Not when enemies scorn you, not when strangers turn away, but when your own blood looks at you as though you were a guest who stayed too long. It was then that the wound opened, not with blood, but with absence, and I knew it would not close. The chair they gave me that night was not chosen. It was spared. It stood at the far edge of the table, angled slightly away, as though I were an afterthought, a figure to be placed where I would take up the least space. I lowered myself into it with the heaviness of a man who once carved every leg of that table with his own hands, who had sanded every chair until his palms were blistered. Once these chairs were built to hold laughter, stories, and family. Now one of them was given to me not as honor, but as pity. I looked around and saw the weight of my work in every detail. The wood had darkened with age, its surface lined with the grooves of meals shared, tears shed, and arguments resolved. I remembered evenings when my voice filled the space, weaving stories that held my children's attention until their eyes grew heavy with sleep. Back then, I was the center, not by force, but by the simple truth that their lives had leaned on mine. But that night, when I opened my mouth, I was met with glances at their watches, quick shifts of attention, the silent plea that I would finish quickly so they could return to their world without me in it. It was not that my stories had grown less meaningful. It was that my presence had grown less valuable to them. The same words, once met with laughter and gratitude, now fell flat into the air like stones dropped into a well too deep to hear the echo. I spoke, and no one interrupted me, but no one listened either. My voice filled only the space in front of me, not their hearts. The cruel irony was that the chair they left me was built by my own hands, just as their futures had been. Every nail, every board of that room carried some mark of my sacrifice, and yet they saw me as though I were seated in borrowed space, a tolerated guest. They had not only forgotten what I gave, they had begun to believe I had never given at all. That chair became more than wood beneath me. It became a mirror. It showed me the truth I had been afraid to face, that the family I once believed unbreakable had already broken me out of it. They had carved out their own circle, and the place they left for me was not one of belonging, but of obligation. I was there not because they wanted me, but because it would have looked cruel to leave me outside. And as I sat in that seat of pity, my stories cut short by the ticking of watches and the shuffle of silverware, I realized something that chilled me deeper than any winter wind. There are few pains heavier than being alive in a room where your presence feels like a burden. When I finally gathered the courage to speak, the noise around the table collapsed into quiet, but it was not the silence of reverence I had once known. It was the silence of dismissal, the kind that falls when a person has said something no one intends to carry, no one intends to hold. Their forks slowed, their hands fidgeted, their eyes dropped to plates or darted toward the clock. My words floated above them, light as dust, scattering without ever landing in their hearts. There was a time when my voice had been the thread binding us together. I could begin a story, and before I reached its middle, their faces would glow with expectation, eager to hear the rest. They used to beg me for just one more tale before bed, to tell them again about the storms I had survived, the battles I had fought just to keep bread on the table. Back then, my words were not mere sentences. They were inheritance, pieces of history passed down from a father to his children. But now, as I spoke, their silence told me my voice was no longer part of the fabric of their lives. It was an unwelcome reminder of a past they no longer wished to claim. The quiet that followed was suffocating. It was not filled with thought, not filled with listening, but with avoidance. They shifted in their seats, nodded mechanically, then reached for another bite, another sip, anything to close the gap my words had opened. Even when I fell silent, no one asked me to continue. No one asked for the end of the story. It was as if I had never spoken at all. I felt the sting not in their rejection, but in their indifference. Rejection, at least, would have left me visible. Indifference turned me into air. My words, once powerful enough to build dreams in their minds, now dissolved into nothing the moment they left my lips. And in that unbearable silence, I understood the final cruelty of being treated like a stranger. Strangers are not shouted down. Strangers are not argued with. Strangers are tolerated, nodded at, endured until they are gone. That was what I had become to them. Someone to endure. Someone whose presence was no longer wanted, but could not yet be denied. As I sat in that chair, my voice still hanging in the emptiness of the room, I felt the crushing weight of truth. The stories I had built my life upon, the sacrifices, the nights without sleep, the years of labor, had all lost their meaning the moment they chose not to listen. What is a legacy if the ones it was meant for let it slip away like dust in the light? And so, the silence after my words became louder than any rejection. It told me everything I needed to know. It told me I was no longer father, no longer guide, no longer the man whose voice could steady the storms. I was a shadow at their table, and every story I carried was sinking into a grave they refused to see. It was in that hollow pause after my words had died and no one cared to gather them that the truth finally settled over me like a shroud. They had already rewritten me in their minds. I was not the man who had once carried their futures on his back. I was not the father whose hands bled to put roofs over their heads. I was not the husband who had stood through storms to hold the house upright. No, in their version of life, I was nothing more than a relic, a fading figure from the past, a chapter they had quietly closed without telling me. And worse than being history, I had become unwanted history, the kind people skip over, the kind they leave out when retelling the story of who they are. I watched them move around me as though I had already died. Their laughter folded over itself, their conversations spilled forward without me, their futures were plotted in sentences that never once included my name. They weren't cruel about it. They didn't push me out the door or strip me of my chair. It was far more brutal than that. They simply lived as though I wasn't there at all. And to them, perhaps, I wasn't. They had decided, without words, without ceremony, that I no longer belonged, that my presence was no longer necessary, that I was gone, even while my body still sat in the corner of their table. I felt the crushing weight of exile, not in distance, but in erasure. To be exiled from your family is not to be sent away. It is to sit among them and realize they have already erased you from their hearts. Every memory I held of raising them, of guiding them, of sacrificing for them, those moments were still etched into my soul, but in theirs I saw only blank pages where my name should have been. They had edited me out of their lives, as if my love, my labor, my very existence were mistakes in the draft of their story. The air around me grew heavy, and it became difficult to breathe. My chest ached, not from age, not from illness, but from the unbearable understanding that I had lived my life pouring myself into theirs, only to be rewritten as a stranger. The years I thought had built a legacy had been quietly stolen, and in their place stood a silence that mocked me with its finality. And in that moment, exile did not feel like something happening to me. It felt like something completed long ago, only now revealed. The truth was, they had been living without me for years. The meals I no longer cooked, the stories they no longer asked for, the advice they never sought. Each absence had been a quiet rehearsal for the day they would no longer need me at all. That day had come, and I was only just realizing it. So I sat there, my hands resting on the table I had once carved, my eyes fixed on the faces that mirrored my own blood, and I understood with a hollow clarity. I was not father. I was not husband. I was not friend. I was the ghost seated among the living. They had chosen to live as though I were already gone. And now, at last, I could feel the grave they had dug for me while I was still breathing. That night, when the house had finally gone quiet, and their laughter had dissolved into sleep, I lay in my room and felt the silence press down on me like a weight I could not move. It was not the peaceful silence of rest, but the suffocating quiet of being unwanted, of being erased in the very place I once built with my own hands. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks I had patched years ago, remembering how I had fixed them so my children would never wake in fear of the roof collapsing. And yet here I was, the man who had held everything together, lying alone in a room that no longer felt like mine. I thought of the years I had given, the strength I poured into endless work, the dreams I set aside so theirs could rise, the countless nights I spent awake, carrying burdens I never let them see. Those sacrifices were not small. They were my life. And now what remained of that life had been reduced to a polite nod, a pity chair, and the silence after my words. They had not just forgotten what I did, they had erased me altogether, as though none of it had ever mattered. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't always come with shouting. It doesn't need slammed doors or harsh words. No, sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is the smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the hug that holds no warmth, the door that closes softly, locking you out without ever admitting it. That is the cruelty that cuts deepest. Not the storm, but the silence after it. I lay there in the dark, my chest tight, my hands clenched as though holding on to a life that had already slipped through my fingers. I searched the shadows for a reason, some explanation that would make sense of the exile, but there was none. It wasn't that I had failed them, it was that they had decided they no longer needed me, no longer wanted me, no longer saw me as part of who they were. In that unbearable quiet, I felt myself becoming smaller, fading piece by piece. I was not just alone in that room. I was nameless. Once I had been called father, husband, protector. Those names had filled me with purpose, but in the silence they were gone. I was nothing more than a man lying in a borrowed bed, in the house that carried my labor, but no longer carried my place. And as I stared at the ceiling, fighting against the weight of that realization, a thought came to me with the sharpness of truth. Perhaps the cruelest kind of death is the one you experience while still breathing, the death of being erased by those you lived for, the death of hearing your name dissolve until it belongs to no one. That night became the first of many without a name. Nights where the silence did not let me sleep, where memories replayed themselves like wounds refusing to heal, and where I understood with aching clarity that exile is not a single moment. It is the slow undoing of everything you once were, carried out in whispers and silence until nothing remains. In the sleepless hours of that night, when the silence pressed so hard it felt like it was crushing the breath from my chest, I understood that my voice no longer had a place in their world. Spoken words had become weightless, slipping past their ears like wind through open windows. I could sit at the table, summon every memory, pour out every sacrifice, and it would all dissolve into air the moment I stopped speaking. My voice, once the anchor of our home, had been reduced to noise, and noise can be ignored. But ink cannot be silenced. Paper does not look away, does not check its watch, does not fidget with discomfort. Paper listens. Paper remembers. And so, in that unbearable night, I reached for a pen I had not touched in years, and pulled an old notebook from the drawer. My hands trembled as I opened it, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I knew I had to do. For the first time in a long time, I would not write to be heard, I would write to be remembered. The pen felt strange between my fingers, almost foreign, like holding a tool I had once mastered but abandoned for too long. Yet as soon as its tip met the page, something inside me cracked open. The words came slowly at first, each one heavy with sorrow, but soon they poured out as if the silence of the past years had been dammed up inside me, waiting for release. Line by line, I carved myself back into existence, into truth, into memory. I wrote of the nights I stayed awake by their bedside when fevers burned through their small bodies. I wrote of the years I bent my back under labor so they would never know the taste of hunger. I wrote of the dreams I once had for myself, the ones I laid down like stones to build the path for theirs. I did not write with anger. I wrote with clarity. My words were not weapons, but records, and as I filled the page, I felt for the first time that my story could not be erased by silence. Every sentence became a shield against the dismissal I had endured. Every memory, once ignored at the table, now lived in ink where no one could interrupt it, no one could talk over it, no one could pretend it wasn't real. I was no longer pleading to be heard. I was carving proof of my existence. The hours slipped by and the house remained quiet, but I no longer feared the silence. The silence had taken my voice, but it could not take my words once they were written. And as I filled page after page, my resolve deepened. If they had chosen to treat me as though I were already gone, then I would leave behind something that even absence could not destroy. By the time dawn crept through the window, the notebook lay heavy in my lap, its pages trembling with truths they had chosen to forget. And I knew then that my life would no longer end in silence. It would end in words, words that demanded to be remembered. Each line I wrote that night felt heavier than ink. It felt like blood leaving my body, drop by drop, shaping itself into words. The pen moved across the page, but what it carved was not just sentences. It was the weight of nights spent holding tools until my hands blistered, mornings that began in darkness so theirs could begin in light, years of breaking myself so they would never have to bend. Every letter was a vein opened, every paragraph a wound confessed. I did not write with rage. Rage is loud, and they had already proven they could outlast my voice. No, what poured onto the page was something quieter, sharper, more unshakable. It was truth, and truth, once written, cannot be interrupted, cannot be silenced with a glance, cannot be swept away by polite indifference. My letter became the record of a life they had tried to erase, a testimony against the dismissal they had cloaked me in. I wrote of the dreams I buried so theirs could bloom, the places I never traveled, the ambitions I folded and placed on dusty shelves, the chances I let slip by so they could reach for more. I wrote of the times I stood in silence, swallowing my own hunger so theirs would be satisfied, the winters I endured in threadbare coats while theirs hung heavy and warm. None of it was to boast. None of it was to beg for thanks. It was simply to remind them that love had lived here, in flesh and sacrifice, even if they had chosen to forget. The pages grew heavier as I filled them, and I could almost feel the weight pressing back at me, as though the paper itself strained beneath the burden of all I had carried. I paused often, staring at the lines, my eyes burning with tears I would not let fall. This was not weeping. This was witness. This was my life, finally being preserved in a way no silence could bury. It was strange, almost sacred, the way the pen became a mirror. With every stroke, I saw myself not as they had dismissed me, an old man fading into irrelevance, but as the man I truly was, the builder, the protector, the one who had laid down piece after piece of his own soul so theirs could rise. And for the first time in years, I felt dignity return, not from their recognition, but from the certainty that the truth of my life was bigger than their indifference. By the time my hand began to cramp and the ink smudged against my fingertips, I knew the letter was no longer just words on paper. It was blood. It was sacrifice. It was the life I had lived, finally given shape where no one could deny it. And if the day came when they read it, they would not be able to turn away, not without facing the weight of everything they had chosen to forget. I laid the pen down slowly, the pages trembling with my truth, and I whispered into the emptiness of the room, not for them, not even for myself, but for the years that had gone unseen. You will not erase me, not now, not ever. I wrote as though it were an open confession, not to a priest, not to a court, but to the very blood that had turned away from me. I poured out the truth that had been rotting inside my chest for years. The loneliness of being invisible in my own home. I described the silence that followed me like a shadow, the way my footsteps echoed through hallways that once rang with the sound of children calling my name. I told them of nights I sat at the edge of my bed, listening to their laughter carry on in rooms I was not invited into, feeling the sting of knowing I had become a ghost long before my body would be buried. But I did not accuse. My words were not sharp like knives, not meant to wound or to lash out. I did not write to punish. I wrote to remind them that once I was the pair of hands that built the world around them, the arms that held them when they were too small to stand on their own, the shoulders that carried the weight they never even saw. I reminded them that every chair around that table, every wall that shielded them from the wind, every plate they filled with food, had been paid for by years I could never get back. I did not beg for a place at that table anymore. I had already seen what my place meant to them, a seat given out of pity, a chair pushed toward the wall, a presence endured rather than cherished. No, I wasn't asking to be welcomed back as father or husband. All I asked, with every trembling line of that letter, was for them to see me, not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as the man whose hands had shaped the life they now lived so carelessly. I confessed the truth of what it felt like to be erased, to sit in the house I had raised and feel as though I were trespassing, to speak into a room and watch my words fall flat, not because they were wrong, but because no one cared enough to hold them. I told them what it was like to give everything you are, and still end up unseen, like a stone buried deep in the foundation, necessary but forgotten. Each sentence felt like peeling away another layer of silence, like carving out a space where my presence could no longer be denied. I did not write with hope that they would love me again, nor with the expectation that they would apologize. I wrote because I refused to leave the earth with my truth buried inside me. My confession was not a plea for mercy, it was a record, proof that I had lived, that I had given, that I had mattered, even if they chose to act as though I never had. When I finished that page, I sat with my hands trembling above the paper, tears blurring the ink until some of the words bled into each other. But even blurred, even imperfect, it was more real than the hollow silence they had left me with. In those pages lived the man they had tried to erase. In those words breathed the father they no longer saw. And though I had been forgotten in life, I would not be forgotten in truth. Near the end, my pen trembled, and I realized I was no longer writing a letter. I was writing a farewell. Not a farewell to life itself, but to the illusion I had clung to, the fragile hope that one day they would look at me and still see their father, their anchor, their beginning. That dream was already gone. I had been holding on to shadows, convincing myself that the warmth I remembered would return if I just stayed quiet, if I just endured. But the truth had been revealed in their indifference, in their hollow smiles, in the silence that followed my words. They no longer saw me. They no longer needed me. They had already chosen to live as though I were a ghost, and this letter was my way of stepping into that truth, on my own terms. Every word in those final paragraphs carried the weight of parting. I did not beg them to change. I did not plead for a place at their table, or for recognition that was already too late. I wrote instead to leave behind what could not be denied, the truth of who I had been, what I had given, and what they had chosen to forget. If they wanted me as a stranger, then I would let them have that, but not before I showed them the man behind the stranger, the man whose blood ran through their veins, whose sacrifices built their world. I would not allow their silence to be the last word spoken over my life. My hand shook as I wrote the final lines. It was not weakness. It was the gravity of knowing this was the last time my voice would reach them, the last time I could place myself into their lives without being dismissed, interrupted, or ignored. On the page they could not turn away. On the page my voice could not be cut short. It would remain, sharp and unmovable, long after I had set down the pen. This was not anger, it was release. Release from the years of waiting for their eyes to soften, from the endless hunger for acknowledgement that never came. Release from the ache of being invisible in the very home I built. By writing farewell, I was no longer their forgotten shadow. I was once again myself, a man who loved, who gave, who endured, who mattered. When the last word bled into the paper, I laid the pen down and let the silence of the room wrap around me. But this silence was different. It was not their dismissal. It was my choice. For the first time, I felt a strange peace. I had told my story, given my truth, and handed it over to the only witness that would not betray me, the page. If they ever chose to read it, they would face me fully, without the shields of indifference or the comfort of pretending I was nothing. They would know me, one last time, as I really was. It was a farewell not to my life, but to the illusion of belonging where I had been erased. And in letting go of that illusion, I felt lighter. The letter had become my monument, my final stand, my proof carved in ink. If they never looked me in the eye again, if they never spoke my name aloud, it would not matter, because the truth was now written, and truth does not die. I folded the pages slowly, each crease feeling like the closing of a chapter I had carried too long. My hands lingered on the paper, trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of everything those pages now held. They were more than ink. They were nights without rest, years of sacrifice, the voice they had silenced finally given permanence. To press the folds into place was to admit that my story no longer lived in their memory, but in these sheets that would outlast their indifference. I slid the letter into an envelope, the rustle of paper echoing in the quiet room like a final breath. For a moment I stared at its blank surface, empty, waiting for me to mark it with something more. Not a name. They had stripped me of that in their world. Not a title. They no longer called me father, husband, or guide. So I wrote only one word: read. Simple, sharp, undeniable. It was not a plea. It was not a demand. It was my last act of faith, that even hearts turned cold might still crack open when faced with truth written plainly before them. The ink of that single word felt heavier than all the others, as though it carried the weight of a verdict. If they chose to open it, they would find me again, not as the shadow at the edge of their table, but as the man who had carried them, fought for them, given himself away so they could stand taller. And if they chose not to, then they would live with silence, but not ignorance. They would know the truth was there, waiting, sealed in their own hands. I pressed the flap closed and felt an unexpected stillness settle over me. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was something deeper, a kind of finality I had never known. For the first time in years, I felt I had taken back control of my own story. They could dismiss my words when I spoke. They could look away when I entered the room. But they could not stop this. This letter was no longer mine. It was theirs to carry, theirs to confront, theirs to break them open or haunt them in silence. I held the envelope to my chest for a moment, feeling the thrum of my own heartbeat against it, as if I were passing my life into its care. And in a way I was. Everything that had been ignored, everything that had been erased, now existed where no denial could touch it. This was not just paper sealed with glue. It was my legacy sealed with finality. And as I set it down, I knew that whatever happened next would no longer depend on their acceptance of me. It would depend on whether they had the courage to do the one thing I asked of them, perhaps for the last time. Read. I placed the envelope on the table as though I were laying down a stone upon a grave. No words, no explanations, only that single word written across it. Read. For a moment I lingered, my hand resting on the wood I had once carved, remembering how many meals, how many birthdays, how many prayers had been shared around this very table when my voice still mattered. Then I stood, my chair scraping softly against the floor, and I walked away. I did not look back. I had already been erased in their eyes. Turning to watch their indifference once more would only reopen the wound I had sealed with ink. Later, I was told what happened after my steps faded down the hallway. The chatter, once effortless, faltered. The laughter, so loud and careless, collapsed into silence. The envelope lay in the center of the table, small but heavier than anything else in that room. Eyes shifted toward it, then quickly away, as though afraid of what waited inside. Someone moved a chair back, the sound sharp and uneasy in the sudden quiet. Hands that had just moments before passed food and glasses began to tremble, unsure whether to reach for the letter or to leave it untouched. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, caught between the world they had built without me and the truth I had left behind. No one spoke. No one dared to laugh again. The weight of my absence was no longer invisible. It was carved into the silence that stretched across their table like a shadow they could not escape. For the first time, they were forced to feel what it meant to be without me. Not because I was gone, but because I had left something behind that could not be ignored. The walls that had once carried their laughter now carried unease. The air grew thick, heavy with the knowledge that inside that envelope lived the man they had chosen to forget. And though they had treated me like a stranger, they knew, deep down, that what waited on those pages was not the voice of a stranger, but the voice of the very blood that had built them, sheltered them, sacrificed for them. The room, once bright and careless, became a chamber of reckoning. No raised voices, no arguments, no cries, just silence, sharp and unrelenting. A silence that did not belong to me anymore, but to them. It was their turn to feel the emptiness, their turn to sit beneath the weight of what had been unspoken for too long. And so, while I walked away into the quiet of my own choosing, the table I left behind became something else entirely. Not a place of celebration, but a place of judgment, where the envelope at its center beat louder than any word they could have said. The room that once ignored me now held its breath, waiting for the truth it had spent years trying not to face. One by one, they reached for the envelope as though it were burning in the center of the table. My son's hand was the first to break the stillness, fingers hesitating before sliding it closer. The paper whispered against the wood, a sound louder than their laughter had ever been. He unfolded the pages, his eyes running across the lines I had bled onto them, and with each word his face tightened. The bravado that once shielded him, the polite distance he used to hold me at arm's length, it all crumbled. His lips parted, but no words came. When the weight of my confession grew too heavy, he dropped the pages to the floor as though they had seared him, his hands shaking with the truth he could no longer deny. My daughter's turn came next, though she tried to resist it. She pressed her palms against her lap, eyes darting to every corner of the room, searching for escape. But silence cornered her, and finally she pulled the paper toward her. As she read, her breath broke in uneven waves. Her shoulders trembled, her face twisted with grief she had buried too long, and at last she raised her hands to cover her face. Behind them, tears streamed freely, unstoppable, the very tears she had denied me when I sat living among them like a shadow. Others leaned closer, their voices low, cracking as the truth wound its way through the room. Apologies stumbled from their lips, apologies too late to give me in person, apologies that fell into the air like broken glass. They whispered words they should have spoken years ago, but the walls swallowed them, and the only witness was the letter itself. The words they had ignored when I spoke, dismissed with glances at their watches, brushed aside with shallow smiles, now pierced them with a force they could not endure. In ink, my voice became undeniable. They could not interrupt, they could not look away, they could not silence me. Each line demanded their attention, and each line broke them in ways my presence never could. The letter stripped away their laughter, tore down the walls of indifference, shattered the illusion that they could live as though I had never mattered. It forced them to face the truth of what they had done. They had turned me into a stranger in my own home, and only in my absence did they begin to understand the magnitude of their loss. The room, once a stage for their joy, became a chamber of mourning, not for my death, but for the love they had buried alive, the years they had squandered, the father they had refused to see until it was too late. And as tears fell freely from eyes that once looked past me, the truth rang louder than any silence ever had. The man they erased had returned in the only way he could, through words they could never erase. When the last page slipped from their hands and fell silently onto the table, something shifted that could never be undone. I was no longer the stranger they had forced into the corner, no longer the quiet presence they tolerated out of obligation. In that moment, through the weight of my words, I became once more what I had always been, the man whose sacrifices could not be erased, whose love was too deeply sown into their lives to ever be denied. They had tried to live as though I were already gone, but the letter proved the truth, that I had never left them, that every breath of theirs had been built upon the ones I gave away. Justice came not as thunder, not as vengeance, not with anger or bitterness. It came softly, but with a force they could not withstand. It came in lines of ink that carried the weight of sleepless nights, the ache of unspoken sacrifices, the fire of a love that endured even rejection. It came in the sound of their own tears, spilling onto the very pages they once would not hear. My voice had been silenced when I sat among them, but written down it rose louder than any cry, impossible to dismiss, impossible to escape. In their tears I saw the chains breaking, the chains of indifference, the blindness of pride, the walls they had built to shut me out. My letter forced them to face what they had refused to acknowledge, that the stranger they pushed aside had been their foundation all along. Their hearts, hardened for years, cracked open, not by argument, not by pleading, but by the truth they had buried until it roared back in ink. Though I was no longer in the room, my presence filled it more completely than it ever had in life. They could not laugh it away. They could not talk over it. They could not look through it. My words sat among them like a mirror they could not turn from, showing them not just who I was, but who they had become. And in that mirror they wept, not only for me, but for themselves, for the years they had wasted, for the love they had allowed to wither in silence. The letter became my legacy, not because it sought revenge, but because it delivered truth, pure, undeniable, carved into paper like stone. It would outlive their excuses, it would outlast their shame, it would remain even when the sound of my voice was forgotten. They could not bury it. They could not erase it. It would stay, heavy in their hands, echoing in their minds, a reminder that love, once given, does not vanish, even when unreturned. And so, though I walked away, leaving them with their feast and their silence, I did not leave empty. My letter stayed behind, alive, unbroken, louder than any voice I had ever spoken. In the end, justice was not thunder or punishment. It was truth, written in ink, carried in tears, and it broke the chains they never admitted had bound them. My final words became the one thing they could never dismiss, the one presence they could never erase. I was no longer the stranger. I was the father. I was the man. I was the truth. And the truth, at last, remained.